A text popped up on her phone while she was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize, a message I'll never forget. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." She came out of the shower, still humming that song she always played in the mornings, towel wrapped around her body like she was some innocent wife with nothing to hide. I didn't say a word. Just smiled, kissed her cheek, and let her believe I was still the clueless, loving husband she thought she could deceive. But in my mind, I was already planning. I played my part well. She didn't suspect a thing. I kept acting like the doting husband, pretending to be too blind, too trusting. But I was watching. I was listening. I followed her when she said she was out with friends. I saw them. Some cheap hotel. Her and him, laughing, touching, kissing like they were in some goddamn love story. I stood outside their window, watching, recording. I could have confronted them then, could have made a scene, but that would have been too easy. Too merciful. I wanted her to feel this. I started planting seeds. A well-placed comment about loyalty during dinner. A casual mention of how my co-worker's wife had cheated on him and ended up losing everything in the divorce. I watched her carefully each time, waiting for cracks in her confidence. She never admitted a thing. Not even when I started staying out late myself, making up stories, ignoring her texts. She was too proud, too full of herself to ever believe I knew. She just thought I was becoming distant. That maybe I was the one having an affair. The irony made me laugh. Then I found out the worst part. She wasn't just cheating. She was using me. My wife, my lying, backstabbing, cheating wife, had plans. She was going to leave me once she secured her citizenship. I found the messages between her and her lover, plotting how she'd stay married just long enough to get what she needed before moving on to better things. I was nothing but a stepping stone to her. That's when I knew. Confrontation wasn't enough. Divorce wasn't enough. She needed to be ruined. The first stage of my revenge was subtle. Psychological warfare. I started leaving little hints that I knew. Logged into my laptop and accidentally left open a website about how to catch a cheating spouse. Made sure she saw me staring at her phone whenever she got a message. Left my wedding ring on the nightstand one morning and didn't wear it all day, just to see if she'd notice. She did. She started getting nervous, jumpy. Snapping at me over small things. I loved watching her squirm. Then I began feeding her lies. I told her I was getting a big promotion. That soon, we'd be able to buy the house she always wanted. I let her think I was still committed, still blind, still the perfect little idiot she could manipulate. And she fell for it. While she was busy sneaking around, I was busy taking everything away from her. I drained our joint accounts little by little, moved the money somewhere she couldn't touch. I gathered every piece of evidence, texts, photos, videos, and compiled it into something airtight. Something that would destroy her if it ever saw the light of day. Then, when everything was ready, I dropped the first bomb. It was a Friday night when I confronted her. Not with anger. Not with accusations. Just cold, hard truth. "I know," I said simply. She blinked. "Know what?" I slid my phone across the table. Let her see the pictures, the texts, the proof of everything she thought she had hidden so well. Her face went pale. "This isn't. Don't bother lying." She tried, of course. Spun some pathetic story about how it wasn't what it looked like, how she was going to end it, how she still loved me. The usual bullshit. I let her talk. Let her dig herself deeper into the hole. Then, when she finally stopped, I leaned forward and whispered, "You should be very afraid." For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. And that was just the beginning. She didn't sleep that night. I did. Slept like a baby, actually. Knowing the first crack had formed in her perfect little world gave me a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. But she tossed and turned, probably replaying every lie she'd ever told me, wondering which one had been the final nail in her coffin. The next morning, she tried to pretend everything was normal. Made coffee. Asked if I wanted eggs. The usual domestic bullshit. I played along because I wasn't done yet. I wanted her desperate. Over the next few days, I became the perfect husband again. Attentive. Sweet. Thoughtful. I'd cook her dinner, bring her flowers, even compliment her on the dress she probably wore to meet him. The confusion in her eyes grew with every gesture. She didn't know what was worse, me being angry or me being kind. That's the thing about guilt. It rots you from the inside out. She was unraveling, second-guessing every word, every glance. She started checking my phone when she thought I wasn't looking, snooping through my emails, trying to figure out what I was planning. But I left nothing for her to find. Because the real plan was already in motion. I reached out to him, her lover. Sent him a message from an anonymous account with just one line. "She's been playing you too." Attached were screenshots of her texts, not to him, but to a third guy. Some other fool she'd been stringing along. Turns out, my wife was more ambitious than I thought. She didn't just have a backup plan, she had options. Within hours, he responded. Angry. Confused. Demanding to know who I was. I didn't reply. Didn't need to. I'd planted the seed, and jealousy would do the rest. By the end of the week, their affair imploded. I didn't even have to lift a finger. He confronted her, they argued, and I sat back, pretending I had no idea why she was suddenly so moody. "Rough day?" I'd ask with a smile. She'd glare, lips pressed into a thin line, too proud to admit the truth. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Money was the next target. While she was busy dealing with her crumbling love life, I made sure to quietly pull every financial rug out from under her. Our joint savings? Gone. The credit cards in her name? Maxed out, on her subscriptions, her accounts. And the cherry on top? I reported fraudulent activity on those cards, freezing them completely. She came home one day, furious. "My card's not working." I looked up from the couch, feigning surprise. "That's weird. Maybe you should call the bank." She did. Listened as they explained that the account was under investigation. I watched her face twist, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. And I still wasn't done. The final act had to be public. I wasn't interested in just ruining her life behind closed doors. No, I wanted witnesses. People she couldn't lie to, couldn't manipulate. So I planned a party. An anniversary celebration, to be exact. Invited friends, family, even her co-workers. She was thrilled, thinking maybe I'd forgiven her, that we were starting fresh. She even went shopping for a new dress, using the last bit of cash she didn't realize was about to disappear. The night of the party, everything was perfect. Candlelight, soft music, the smell of catered food filling the house. She floated around, playing the role of the loving wife, laughing with guests, holding my hand like nothing had ever happened. Then it was time for my speech. I stood in front of everyone, glass of champagne in hand, and smiled. "I just want to say how grateful I am to be surrounded by friends and family tonight," I began, glancing at her. She beamed, probably expecting some cheesy tribute about love and commitment. Instead, I continued, "This year has been full of surprises. Some good. And some eye-opening." The room grew quiet. I could feel her eyes on me, confusion morphing into something else, fear. "I've learned a lot about love. About trust. And about betrayal." Whispers rippled through the crowd. She shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. I raised my phone, connected to the TV screen behind me. With a simple click, the slideshow began, not of our wedding photos, but of her texts, her photos with him, even the hotel receipts. Every dirty little secret laid bare for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a glass. She didn't say a word. Just stood there, frozen, as her carefully constructed world shattered around her. When the slideshow ended, I turned back to the crowd, raised my glass, and said, "To truth." Then I walked out. But that wasn't the end. No, that was just the beginning of her downfall. And I wasn't done yet. I didn't look back as I walked out that night. Behind me, chaos erupted, voices raised, people whispering, some outright shouting. I imagined her standing there, drenched in humiliation, trying to gather the shreds of her dignity off the floor. But it was gone, scattered like confetti. And I wasn't there to pick up the pieces. The night air felt different, cleaner, sharper. Like every breath I took was proof that I was finally free from the weight of pretending. But this wasn't closure. No, closure is for people who want peace. I wanted her to suffer. The next day, I made my move. I filed for divorce, of course. But not quietly. I made sure the paperwork was delivered to her workplace, hand-delivered, in fact, by a process server who announced her full name loud enough for her co-workers to hear. I pictured the way they'd look at her afterward, pretending they weren't curious, whispering behind her back the second she walked away. But that was just the legal part. The real damage came from what I'd been preparing for weeks. She didn't know that while she was busy juggling her affairs, I'd been gathering more than just texts and photos. Bank statements, hidden credit card charges, even copies of messages where she'd admitted to using me for her own gain. I packaged it all neatly into a file labeled for review and sent it to her boss anonymously. Why? Because she worked in a position where character mattered. Trust was everything. And nothing shatters trust like proof you're a liar and a fraud. She was fired within a week. I thought that would be enough. But then I found out about him, her precious lover. Turns out, he had more to lose than she did. A wife of his own, kids, a respectable job, and a carefully curated image as a family man. I couldn't resist. I sent his wife everything. All the evidence, all the dirty little details. She didn't just confront him. She burned his life to the ground. Divorce. Custody battle. Public shame. And the best part? He blamed her. I thought she'd break. But she didn't. Not at first. She tried to fight back. Sent me angry texts, left voicemails filled with rage, begging, even threats. She showed up at my door once, mascara streaked and shaking, demanding to know why I was doing this. I opened the door just enough for her to see me smile and said, "Because you deserve it." Then I shut the door in her face. But here's the thing about people like her, they don't just fall apart overnight. They unravel slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the wreckage of who they pretended to be. And I was patient. Months passed. Her life crumbled like a house of cards. No job. No lover. No reputation. She had to move out of our apartment because she couldn't afford the rent. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was staying with a friend, sleeping on a couch in a shitty one-bedroom apartment, barely scraping by. But I wasn't done. I waited until I knew she was at her lowest, then sent her one last message. I hope every time you close your eyes, you remember what you lost. No threats. No insults. Just the truth. Because the real revenge wasn't in what I took from her. It was in what she'd never get back. Me. But life has a funny way of adding its own twists. About a year later, I got a message from her. A simple, desperate line. "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" I didn't respond right away. I let it sit there, unread, while I considered what kind of man I wanted to be. The petty part of me wanted to ignore her. But the colder part, the part she created, had one more lesson to teach. I agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe, neutral ground. She looked different, thinner, tired, like life had drained the shine right out of her. She smiled when she saw me, like maybe there was still hope buried under all the ruins. We talked. She apologized, of course. Said she'd been foolish, that she missed me, that she'd learned from her mistakes. She even cried, dabbing her eyes with a napkin like it would wipe away everything she'd done. I listened. Nodded. Even reached out to hold her hand for a moment, just to watch her face light up with that flicker of hope. Then I leaned in and whispered, "I just wanted to see what rock bottom looks like." I stood up, left some cash on the table, and walked away. This time, I did look back, just long enough to see her face collapse. And that's when I knew I'd won. After that final meeting, I thought it would be over. I thought I'd walk away, leave her sitting in that cafe, drowning in the consequences of her own decisions. But the thing about revenge is, it doesn't just disappear. It stays with you. It feeds on you, even when you think you're the one in control. I wasn't done. Not yet. It started with the dreams. Not nightmares, exactly. Just vivid flashes, her face crumpling in that cafe, the hollow look in her eyes as I walked away. You'd think it would have been satisfying. But satisfaction fades. It's like scratching an itch until you bleed. You feel relief for a moment, but then all you're left with is the wound. So I did what I always did when things got too quiet, I watched. I knew where she lived. A rundown apartment in the part of town where streetlights flicker and rent is paid in cash. I'd drive by sometimes, late at night, just to see if her lights were on. Just to remind myself she was still stuck in the life I'd left her with. But one night, something changed. I saw him. He wasn't the original lover, the smug, married man whose life I'd already dismantled. No, this was someone new. Some cheap replacement, the kind of guy who thought a leather jacket made him dangerous. They were arguing on the sidewalk, voices sharp in the cold night air. And then he hit her. Just like that. No warning. No hesitation. A slap that sent her stumbling back against the brick wall of the building. I didn't feel anger. Not right away. Just curiosity. Was this what she'd chosen over me? Was this the life she'd built after burning hours to the ground? I should have driven away. But I didn't. The next day, I followed him. It wasn't hard. He had routines, like everyone else. Morning coffee at the same corner bodega. Gym sessions where he'd flex in the mirror more than he actually worked out. A job at some auto repair shop where he probably thought being covered in grease made him tough. I learned everything about him. His schedule. His habits. His weaknesses. And then I introduced myself. It was casual at first. Ran into him at a bar near his apartment, pretended we'd met somewhere before. He didn't recognize me, why would he? To him, I was just another guy buying around, sharing a laugh. We drank. We talked. He bragged about the women in his life, though he never mentioned her by name. Figures. She wasn't even important enough to be a story. But I made sure I became part of his story. Over the next few weeks, we became friends. I learned everything he was too stupid to keep to himself. His petty scams, his debts, the people he owed money to, people who weren't nearly as patient as I was. And when the time was right, I lit the fuse. Anonymous tips to the wrong people. A whisper here, a nudge there. I didn't even have to get my hands dirty. I just watched as the walls closed in on him. Debts came due. Fights broke out. He lost his job after someone tipped off his boss about a theft he didn't commit, but who'd believe him when the evidence was so neatly placed? And when he hit rock bottom, I was there. He showed up at my door one night, blood on his knuckles, desperation in his eyes. "I need help, man," he gasped. I let him in. Poured him a drink. Listened to his sob story. And then I told him the truth. I told him who I was. Told him everything I'd done. Watched as the realization sank in, that he wasn't just unlucky. He'd been targeted. He lunged at me, but I was ready. The fight was quick, brutal, and satisfying in a way nothing else had been. When it was over, he was on the floor, gasping, bleeding, broken in more ways than one. I knelt beside him, my voice calm. "Now you know what it feels like to lose everything." I left him there. I don't know what happened to him after that. Don't care. But the next time I drove by her apartment, he was gone. She was alone again. Exactly where she belonged. But the story doesn't end there. Because life has a funny way of circling back. And just when I thought I'd buried the past, she showed up again. At my door. She stood at my door like a ghost, thin, hollow-eyed, nothing like the woman I'd married. Her face was pale, bruises fading yellow along her jawline, probably souvenirs from the last guy I'd watched crumble under his own pathetic weight. But this wasn't pity in my chest. It wasn't even satisfaction anymore. It was curiosity. How far could she still fall? She didn't speak right away. Just stood there, her eyes searching mine for what? Mercy? Redemption? Some piece of the man she used to manipulate? I gave her nothing. "What do you want?" My voice was flat, emotionless, the kind of tone that lets people know you've already decided they don't matter. She swallowed hard, clutching her coat like it was the only thing holding her together. I didn't know where else to go. A long pause stretched between us. Then I stepped aside. "Come in." Not because I cared. But because I wanted to see how low she'd sink. The apartment was cold, deliberately so. I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't offer her anything. She hovered by the door like a stray dog, unsure if it was welcome or just waiting to be kicked. Finally, she spoke. "I know you hate me. I deserve that." I said nothing. Let the silence do the work. She tried again. "I'm sorry. For everything. I thought I had it all figured out. But I didn't." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. But she didn't. She begged instead. She told me her life was a mess. She'd lost her job. Couldn't find another because her reputation was shot. The guy she'd left me for was gone, and the next guy had been worse, a parasite who drained what little she had left. She was drowning in debt, her so-called friends had disappeared, and she had nowhere to go. "I just need a place to stay for a little while," she whispered. "Just until I get back on my feet." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Then I smiled. Of course. She moved in the next day. I gave her the spare room, the same one where she used to hide her secrets, the same four walls that had witnessed the start of her betrayal. I watched her every day, her pride shrinking with each favor she had to ask. She tried to act grateful, tried to be polite, but underneath it all, she was still the same manipulative liar, thinking maybe she could twist this into some kind of second chance. But this wasn't forgiveness. This was the next phase. It started small. I'd forget to buy groceries, leaving her with nothing to eat unless she asked me directly. I made her earn every bite, every small comfort. She'd grit her teeth and ask politely, trying to keep some shred of dignity intact. Then I'd crank up the thermostat in the winter, let the apartment turn to ice unless she asked for heat. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. She started looking for work, but I made sure that never went anywhere. Anonymous calls to potential employers, subtle suggestions about her issues, a little doubt goes a long way when someone's already desperate. She grew more fragile with each rejection, her spirit cracking like thin glass. Then, one night, she broke completely. She stood in the living room, trembling, tears streaking down her face. "Why are you doing this to me?" I leaned back in my chair, sipping a drink, calm as ever. "You did this to yourself." Her knees gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Not the dramatic kind of crying she used to weaponize, but the ugly, raw kind, like her soul was trying to claw its way out. I watched in silence, letting her drown in it. Then I stood, walked over, and knelt beside her. "You think this is rock bottom?" I whispered. "We're not even close." The next morning, I kicked her out. No warning. No explanation. Just tossed her things into the street, locked the door, and never looked back. I heard later that she ended up at a shelter. Lost, broken, forgotten. Exactly where she belonged. But even then, it didn't feel like the end. Because revenge doesn't have an end. It just changes shape. Weeks passed after I threw her out, and the silence was deafening. You'd think that after dismantling someone's life piece by piece, there'd be a sense of closure, a full stop at the end of a sentence written in betrayal and payback. But revenge isn't neat like that. It's messy, lingering like smoke in a room long after the fire's gone out. I'd won. I knew that. But victory felt hollow. Not because I regretted it. I didn't. I just realized something worse: she'd left her mark on me, too. And I wasn't sure I'd ever scrub it off. I kept tabs on her, of course. It wasn't about obsession. It was about confirmation. I needed to see the consequences stick. Through the same friends we once shared, mutual acquaintances who didn't even realize they were feeding me updates, I heard about her spiral. She bounced between couches and shelters, occasionally landing jobs that never lasted. She tried dating again, but no one sticks around when you're broken and bleeding bitterness. One day, I heard she'd been arrested. Petty theft. She'd tried to steal from a grocery store, basic stuff. Bread. Milk. Cheap toiletries. I laughed when I heard. Not because it was funny, but because it was poetic. A woman who once plotted her life like a chess master reduced to stealing to survive. But the story wasn't done with me. It was a cold evening when I saw her again. By chance, or fate, if you believe in that sort of thing. I was leaving a cafe, the warmth of fresh coffee in my hand, when I noticed someone sitting on the curb outside. Hood pulled over her head, face shadowed. Just another stranger in a city full of them. Until she looked up. Her face was thinner, more hollow, but I knew those eyes. For a split second, our gazes locked. Recognition flashed, followed by something else: shame, fear, maybe even a ghost of old resentment. She didn't move. She just stared, waiting to see what I'd do. I could have kept walking. Pretended she was nobody. But I didn't. I walked over, stood in front of her, casting a shadow she couldn't ignore. "Looks like life's been kind," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. She didn't respond. Just looked down at her hands, thin fingers wrapped around a cup that probably hadn't seen a coin in hours. "I thought you'd be dead by now," I added, sipping my coffee. Still no words. Just silence thick enough to choke on. I crouched down, leveling my eyes with hers. "You thought you'd get away with it, didn't you?" She finally spoke, Her voice barely a whisper. I lost everything. I leaned in closer. Good. Then I stood, tossed a crumpled bill into her empty cup, not out of kindness, but as a final insult. The price of betrayal, reduced to spare change. And I walked away. But even as I turned the corner, her hollow gaze burned in the back of my mind. Not because I cared, but because I didn't. Days turned into weeks, and I thought about that encounter more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't guilt. It was something uglier. A realization I hadn't expected. I'd become something else. Revenge had changed me. Hardened me. Left a scar deeper than the ones I'd carved into her life. And maybe that was the real cost. Months later, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name scrawled on the envelope, shaky handwriting that felt oddly familiar. I opened it. I know you hate me. I deserve it. But you should know, I never stopped thinking about you. Not because I miss you, but because you were the last thing I had that felt real. I hope you're happy. I hope it was worth it. Because for me, you were the best and the worst thing that ever happened. I guess that's your victory. And my punishment. No signature. But I didn't need one. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Was I happy? I wasn't sure. But it was worth it. After that night in the park, I expected her to disappear, to fade into the background like the discarded shadow of a life long forgotten. But something strange happened. She didn't vanish. She survived. Barely. I kept tabs on her, of course. It wasn't obsession, not in the way people throw that word around. This was different. It was maintenance. Like checking in on a garden you've scorched to see if any weeds dare grow back. And there she was. A stubborn weed. She'd found a part-time job cleaning offices at night, scrubbing floors, emptying trash bins, the kind of work she used to sneer at when she thought she was better than everyone else. She didn't have much, but she had something. And I couldn't let that stand. It was almost laughably easy. A call to her supervisor, anonymous of course. A fabricated story about theft, wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. After all, people like her, women with nothing left, clinging to scraps, are the first ones everyone suspects when something goes missing. She was fired within days. No severance. No second chances. When I drove past her shelter that night, I saw her sitting on the curb, her face buried in her hands. And I smiled. But this time, something was different. She didn't break the way I expected. Didn't collapse into herself like before. She fought back. Not against me, she didn't even know it was me. No, she fought against the world, clawing her way towards survival like some wounded animal too stubborn to die. She found another job, waitressing at a rundown diner where the coffee tasted like burnt regret. She worked double shifts, barely sleeping, her body growing thinner with every passing week. And still, she survived. That's when I realized something. Destroying her life wasn't enough. I needed to destroy her will, so I changed tactics. Instead of tearing down everything she built, I decided to let her have it, just enough to hope, to believe things might get better. And then I'd take it away. Over and over again. I let months pass without interference. She got a small apartment, barely more than a closet with a bed, but it was hers. She even started smiling again, small, fragile smiles, the kind people wear when they're afraid of losing them. That's when I struck. I left a note taped to her door. No threats. No signature. Just one sentence. Did you really think I'd forget? The next day, she was late to work. Distracted. Nervous. I watched from across the street as she jumped at every shadow, her paranoia growing like a disease. She started locking her door 3, 4, 5 times in a row. Staring over her shoulder when she walked down the street. Losing sleep. Losing weight. I didn't have to touch her life anymore. Her mind was doing all the work for me. Weeks turned into months. She lost her job, not because of me this time, but because she couldn't function anymore. She'd show up late, forget orders, snap at customers. Eventually, even the diner couldn't make excuses for her. She spiraled again, falling deeper this time. No friends. No money. No hope. Just fear. And then she came looking for me. I wasn't surprised when she showed up at my door again, her face hollow, eyes wild with desperation. I opened the door slowly, leaning against the frame, completely at ease. She didn't even bother pretending to be strong. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice brittle. I stared at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Nothing." Confusion flickered across her face. She wasn't expecting that. She was expecting demands, conditions, something she could fight against. But there was nothing left to fight. Because the war was already over. I closed the door without another word. And this time, I didn't look back. Because I didn't need to. I'd already won. After that final encounter, I thought it was over. I believed I'd buried her spirit so deep it would never claw its way back to the surface. I told myself I was done, that revenge had run its course, that there was nothing left to destroy. But something about silence felt unfinished. Because when you've built your entire existence around watching someone fall apart, what happens when there's nothing left to watch? Weeks passed without a trace of her. No sightings. No whispers from mutual acquaintances. Not even a fleeting shadow crossing my path. At first, I convinced myself it was a victory. She was gone. Out of my life, out of my head. But the emptiness grew louder than her absence. So, I went looking. It wasn't about obsession. At least, that's what I told myself. It was about closure. I tracked her down to a part of the city I'd never thought she'd end up in, a place where people go when they've got nothing left, where the streets swallow you whole, and no one bothers to remember your name. I found her sitting outside a soup kitchen, wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers, face gaunt, eyes blank. She wasn't the woman I married. She wasn't even the woman I'd spent months breaking down. She was nothing. And yet, I felt something I hadn't expected. Disappointment. I watched her from a distance, waiting for a flicker of the defiance I once hated. But there was nothing. No spark. No fight. She was hollow. A shell. And for the first time, I wondered, had I gone too far? Not out of guilt. No, guilt was a luxury I'd buried long ago. It was something worse. Boredom. I left without speaking to her. But the image of her haunted me more than her betrayal ever did. Not because I missed her. I missed the game. And that's when it hit me, revenge isn't satisfying when there's no one left to feel it. So, I decided to reignite the fire. Not for her. For me. I approached her the next day, casual as ever, like running into an old friend. She didn't recognize me at first. That was the most insulting part, not the betrayal, not the lies, but the fact that I'd carved her destruction into existence, and she looked at me like I was a stranger. But then recognition flickered in her eyes, and with it came fear. "Good. Long time no see," I said, sitting beside her on the cracked concrete. She didn't respond. Just stared ahead, as if ignoring me would make me disappear. But I was never going to disappear. I leaned in, my voice low and calm. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Her hands trembled slightly, gripping the sleeves of her tattered coat. But she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just whispered, "Why are you still here?" I smiled. "Because I can be." Over the next few weeks, I reinserted myself into her life, not as an aggressor, but as a shadow. Always there. Always watching. She'd turn a corner and see me standing across the street. She'd wake up in the shelter to find small notes tucked under her blanket. "I see you. Still breathing? Not done yet." Nothing threatening. Nothing illegal. Just enough to remind her she was never alone. And it worked. She unraveled again, paranoia eating away at what little sanity she had left. She stopped sleeping. Stopped eating. Started mumbling to herself in the streets, warning strangers about the man who was always watching. No one believed her, of course. Because that's the beauty of psychological warfare, when done right, it looks like madness. But even that grew dull eventually. Because you can only break something so many times before there's nothing left to shatter. And she was gone. Mentally, emotionally, everything that made her human had been stripped away. I stood over her one last time, watching as she sat on a park bench, staring at nothing, her mind lost somewhere I'd carefully led it. And I realized. I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. I thought I'd feel something. Standing there, watching her, a husk of the woman who once thought she was clever enough to outmaneuver me, I expected the satisfaction to rush in, fill the emptiness like a final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. But there was nothing. Just silence. The kind that echoes louder than any scream. Weeks passed. I tried to move on, whatever that even meant. Life settled into a routine: work, sleep, meaningless interactions with people who'd never guess what I'd done, what I was still capable of. But there was a hollowness that followed me, a shadow I couldn't shake. Because here's the truth no one tells you about revenge: it's not a destination. It's an addiction. And I was starving. I found myself driving past that same park, long after she disappeared from it. The bench where she used to sit was empty now, reclaimed by weather and neglect. But it wasn't the bench I was looking for. It was her. I had to know if she was still out there somewhere, still breathing, still suffering. So, I looked. It didn't take long to track her down. A homeless shelter 2 cities over, the kind of place people end up when they've exhausted every last shred of hope. She was thinner now, skin stretched tight over bones, hair matted, eyes dull. But she was alive. And that was enough. For now. I didn't approach her right away. I watched from a distance, slipping back into the role of the invisible architect of her misery. She had no idea I was there, no idea that even after everything, I was still pulling the strings. But something was different this time. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not because she'd grown stronger, no, that would have been easier to hate. She wasn't afraid because she didn't care. That's when I realized I'd made a mistake. Revenge thrives on emotion, fear, anger, regret. It feeds off those raw, vulnerable pieces of a person's soul. But what happens when there's nothing left to feed on? When the person you've dedicated your life to destroying no longer feels anything at all? You're left with nothing but the emptiness you carved out of them. And it stares back at you like a mirror. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I approached her one last time, not with threats or mind games, but with something I hadn't felt in years: desperation. She was sitting alone, staring at the cracked pavement beneath her feet, when I sat down beside her. She didn't flinch. Didn't even turn her head. Just whispered, "What do you want now?" The words hit harder than any slap, not because of what she said, but how she said it, flat, indifferent, like I was nothing more than background noise. For the first time, I didn't know how to answer. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, she spoke again. "You ruined my life," she said softly, like stating a fact as simple as the weather. "But you're still here. Why?" I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was ugly. I wasn't there because of what she'd done to me. I was there because without her, I was nothing. She stood up, leaving me there on that broken bench, alone with the realization I'd been too blind to see. I hadn't destroyed her. I'd become her. I sat there long after she left, staring at the cracks in the pavement where her shadow had been. The emptiness that had been gnawing at me for months felt heavier now, like it had finally settled into my bones. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Revenge was supposed to be the cure, the fire that would burn away the betrayal, the humiliation, the ache of being used. But all it had done was hollow me out until there was nothing left but echoes. I didn't just destroy her. I dismantled myself, piece by piece. I tried to go back to my life. The routines. The small talk. Pretending to care about meaningless things like office deadlines and weekend plans. But everything felt fake, like I was walking through a life that didn't fit anymore. I started seeing her face everywhere. Not the woman she'd become, the fragile, broken thing I'd left behind. No, I saw her, the one who used to laugh with me, touch me like I mattered, lie to me with that perfect smile. And it ate at me. Not because I missed her. But because I missed having something to destroy. One night, I found myself outside her shelter again. I didn't plan to be there. My car just drove itself, like some part of me wasn't ready to let go. She was there, sitting on the curb, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. I watched her for a long time, hidden in the shadows, trying to figure out what I was feeling. Regret? No. It was something worse. Emptiness. I approached her without thinking, my footsteps loud against the cracked pavement. She didn't look up. I stood there, waiting, like I needed her acknowledgement to exist. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Still here?" I swallowed hard, The words I'd rehearsed in my head evaporating into the cold night air. "Yeah, I managed." She finally looked up, her eyes dull, but not with fear. Not even hate. Just exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" I didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, I didn't know what I wanted. I'd taken everything, her dignity, her security, her sanity. There was nothing left to strip away. And yet, I was still standing there, like some pathetic ghost haunting a grave I'd dug myself. "I don't know," I admitted. She gave a small, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Then why are you still here?" I had no idea. I sat down beside her, both of us silent for a long time. No words. No games. Just two people broken in different ways, sitting in the ruins of what used to be a life. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You know, you never really won." I turned to her, my jaw tightening. "What do you mean?" She looked me in the eyes, really looked, like she was seeing through every layer of bitterness and rage I'd built up. "Winning means moving on." The words hit harder than any revenge I'd ever planned. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I hadn't moved on. I'd been stuck, trapped in a cycle I'd created, chasing a victory that didn't exist. She may have lost everything, but I was the one still chained to the past. I stood up abruptly, needing to escape, not from her, but from the truth sitting between us. I didn't say goodbye. Didn't look back. But her words followed me, echoing in my head with every step I took. Winning means moving on. For the first time in years, I realized I hadn't won it all. And maybe I never would. I didn't sleep that night. Her words looped in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. Winning means moving on. It gnawed at me, not because I believed it, but because it was the one thing I'd never considered. I thought winning was about power, control, watching her life crumble under the weight of my wrath. But standing there beside her, both of us reduced to shadows of who we used to be, I realized I wasn't in control. I was trapped. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions, work, small talk, meaningless tasks, all while her voice echoed in the back of my mind. I built my entire identity around her destruction. Every calculated move, every piece of her life I'd ripped apart, it was all I had. Without that, what was left? Who was I? I started drinking more. Not the casual kind, not even the "I've had a rough day" kind. This was different. This was an escape, a way to drown out the silence she'd left behind. But the problem with drowning is, eventually, you have to come up for air. And when I did, she was still there. Not physically. Not anymore. But in my head. I found myself driving past the shelter again, against every rational thought in my mind. But she wasn't there. I checked the park. The bench where we'd shared that last, hollow conversation. Empty. I don't know how long I drove around that night, searching for a ghost. When I finally found her, she was sitting outside a convenience store, huddled against the cold, her face gaunt and pale under the flickering streetlight. I didn't approach her. I just watched. She didn't look like the woman I'd married. She didn't even look like the woman I'd spent years destroying. She was a stranger. A stranger I couldn't let go of. I left without speaking to her, but something inside me had shifted. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about me. About the hole she'd left in my life, the one I'd tried to fill with her suffering. But no matter how much I took from her, it never filled the void. Because revenge doesn't heal. It consumes. I spent the next week trying to avoid her memory, burying myself in work, in distractions. But nothing stuck. So I went back. Not to torment her. Not this time. I just needed to see her. To prove to myself that whatever power she had over me was gone. She was in the same spot, bundled in the same thin coat, staring blankly at the ground. I approached slowly, unsure of what I'd even say. When she noticed me, her reaction wasn't fear. It wasn't anything. Just a tired, indifferent glance before she looked away again. Like I was no one. And maybe I was. I sat down beside her without asking. We didn't speak for a long time. Then she broke the silence. "Why do you keep coming back?" I didn't have an answer. I stared at the cracked pavement, the same way she did, hoping it held answers I couldn't find in my own mind. After a long pause, I whispered, "I don't know." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "You destroyed me. Isn't that what you wanted?" I swallowed hard, the words thick in my throat. It was. Silence stretched between us again, heavy and suffocating. Then she said something I'll never forget. "So why do you look more broken than me?" I didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. She stood up, her frail body silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlights. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," she whispered, before walking away. Leaving me there, alone. Not victorious. Not defeated. Just empty.